Thanks, Alice. Thanks, Alice. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the organizers. I'm really glad to talk to you about the book. And thanks for people who came. And I decided to talk very briefly about the book to have time to discuss with you a bit. So I prepared only 3 points to discuss. The first point is, let me see if it works. Okay. First point is about my research and the type of research I did during these 15 years, more or less in the same neighborhood in São Paulo, in a district called Sapopemba. In some neighborhoods within this district, especially this favela you have below me in the background, that is called Parque Santa Madalena. So I will talk very briefly about this research, and then the PCC, the most important criminal group in São Paulo that was like emerging in the favelas at the beginning of 2000s, when I was also starting my field work. And at the end, like the consequences of my field work to understand urban theory or political theory with the idea of normative regimes that are in the core, in the center of my argumentation in this book. So, as I was telling you, I did research in this place for many years, and it became also collective research when I came to the university and I had my students working on this, and also in the Center for Metropolitan Studies. And so I studied many issues and many themes in a long-term ethnography. So I started studying social movements, then like how everyday life was related to violence, then especially the state, and the state studied by the perspective, by this marginal perspective, by the fringes of state action, and then aesthetics, and we studied a lot of music and other aesthetics production in urban poor neighborhoods, especially the rap, the Brazilian rap. We studied a lot the rap, and then we studied I've been studying the PCC, but I had the opportunity of condense and gather the different parts of my study about the PCC in everyday life, like this criminal group, this specific criminal group, in a book, in a Brazilian book. Then we studied illicit markets, especially car theft markets and drug and gangs markets in this favela, and how it was connected to many transnational flows. And then I try to gather all of these things in this book, because it's the Entangled City is my first book in English. So I decided to try to put like together these discussions and to make a kind of overall understanding about all this long-term field work. So my field work, those are like good friends that I made in my field work, and this very little boy now is a big man. So we are like following life stories in this field work, trying to connect life stories, family stories, organizations, like very grassrooted organizations in these favelas, like trying to follow the trajectories or the journeys or the life stories of these people, places, families, organizations. And also sometimes we are also following objects, like during their journeys. For example, we followed stolen cars and trying to understand how they are connected to legal markets, insurance companies, and then auctions and etc. So in this field work, we are just trying to put time to work in our favor and trying to really have a long-term discussion. So this led me to follow life stories, to follow these stories. We could, like, in a sense, sketch like the urban transformations in São Paulo. And I think it helped me a lot to understand how crime emerged and how violence is related to all of these very huge transformations in urban fabric. So if you look at this, most part of my stories, but at this table, most part of my stories start when people came to São Paulo from like rural areas in the north part of the country. Most part of my interlocutors came to São Paulo from the north of the country during the 70s, during dictatorship, during the economic miracle in Brazil, based on industrialization in São Paulo. So they came to São Paulo with a family project of social mobility. It is very regular in my field work, in the family stories, and of course they were based in a rural form of structuring their families, and they were Catholic. They came to places where there was nothing. So most part of my life stories start with people saying, when I came here to this neighborhood, there was nothing here. We started to build our home and to open streets to get, and we had to walk 5 kilometers to reach public transportation, or we had to walk 2 kilometers to have water and etc. But we worked a lot and we succeeded, or not, but we tried to improve our lives. So this kind of social mobility project is very important to understand this whole sociability, this whole social world. So at this moment in the 70s, especially 60s, 70s, there was no violence in these places. There was a kind of very few crimes, very few issues related to public security, and there was no public policies related to security. So people organized themselves and try to pay like policemen who lived in the neighborhood or something, like to repress and sometimes to kill the youngsters who were like causing some problem in the neighborhood. But it was, I would say, it was naive if we compare with this kind of machine of crime and police repression that we have today. So if we compare what happened in 40 years or 15 years or 50 years, sorry, the most important categories: work, consumption, family, migration, religion, urban infrastructure, how favelas are represented in public debate, and violence. Everything changed a lot, but those categories continue to be entangled, to be part of the same social world. So everything changes, and if we look through generations, we will see that young people are living in a very different world if we compare to their parents' world. So everything changed, but all of this continued to be important. So religion is really very important today, but it changed a lot. It was Catholic. Now it's in favelas. most part of people are engaged in evangelical churches, and the theology is completely different, etc., etc. So this is more or less the context to discuss the PCC and how crime emerged as a normative regime in these favelas. So after the 90s, with the economic, with the globalization, I would say, with the economic opening of our markets, and the economic crisis that came because all the national infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, and etc. was completely changing. After the 90s, we had two related processes. In a hand, we have this very strong economic crisis. In another hand, we had the opportunity to have access to global markets. So legal global markets and illegal ones. So, and especially the drug trade and especially the cocaine trade came to São Paulo at the beginning of the 90s. In Rio, 10 years before, but this kind of controlling violence in poor neighborhoods avoided cocaine to reach São Paulo until the 90s. But in the 90s, we had what people call the wars period. I mean, a lot of money flowing through cocaine market in a moment where a lot of people were unemployed. So unemployment grew from 8% to 23% in São Paulo during the 90s. And the cocaine flows came into the city. So there was a lot of people like being attracted to this cocaine trade. And of course, there was a lot of money flowing, a lot of guns coming to protect the money, and a lot of wars between different groups in poor neighborhoods in São Paulo. So homicide rates increased a lot during the 90s in this moment. Okay. At the same time, the government were starting the mass incarceration program. As homicide rates were increasing, government said, no, we have to repress crime in poor neighborhoods. We have to incarcerate. We have to punish people to avoid the revenge chains and etc. So a lot of people fighting in a war, in a real war outside the prisons, and the government putting them together in the prisons. So PCC was one of the hundreds of criminal groups inside prisons in São Paulo at the beginning of the 90s. But PCC managed to tell people another story and to tell people another thing about this conflict. So PCC managed to tell people we have to have peace among us. We have to be united to make our war on the system, against system. So PCC, of course, killed a lot of other groups, but they managed to have a lot of people gathered in a same community of criminals, I would say. And there was very important to them to fight against oppression. So they talked a lot about fight against oppression in this moment. And from 93 to 2001, PCC was a criminal group inside prisons in São Paulo. But after 2001, we start to listen to people talking about PCC, also producing order inside the favelas, and it was very fast, I would say. In 5 years, I was doing field work at that time. I didn't understand much about PCC at that time, But I heard a lot about it. I heard a lot how the rap was singing the magic formula of peace, how the samba was talking about peace, how like the pagode was talking about peace, how capoeira was talking about peace, and how we have to be together in this moment to face the system and etc. So what PCC did in the favelas at that moment was to talk about the criminal chiefs and to say, look, we won't fight you to have your resources or to have your money. We don't want your money. We just want two things from you, from a criminal chief, a drug dealer in a favela, for example. The guys from PCC said, we want you to keep the guns from your kids. I mean, if you have some issue, you call us, and we will have the right way to solve these questions and these issues. There's a lot of mothers crying, so we don't want to have mothers crying anymore. There's our mothers crying. So they have a very moral discourse, and at the same time they were calling for the monopoly of justice and disposal of violence in the territory. Also, they said, we don't want your money, but we do want you to fix the price of your drugs. So no one will have competence with the other dealers here in the region, because everybody is coming to the same system. So we don't want you to have different prices. So they were intervening in the illegal markets, like very clearly, and regulating those markets. At the same time, they were regulating violence, and it was good for everyone, because the guy who says, yes, I do want to be part of this network, baptized or not in PCC, and PCC works more or less as a network, as a freementary of crime. I mean, there's a lot of autonomous, independent entrepreneurs like connected in this brotherhood called PCC, and they started to have more. They started to have much more. They started to be much more active in terms of delivering justice when people had problems. Let me try to move the slides. Don't know what's happening. No. Sorry. Yes. So just to tell you that PCC started to do those things, and PCC developed their actions very quickly throughout the huge illegal market, and really producing policies related to urban order. I won't talk about all of these, but of course, what I wanted to show you is that state policies like starting mass incarceration have reactions by the side of crime, and there's a lot of other policies produced by the criminal world that in a sense instrumentalizes public or state policies to grow the criminal networks. The effect of PCC hegemony in peripheries in São Paulo is very, very intense in many senses, but especially in terms of homicides reduction. So in the same moment, homicides were growing in the country, and after a huge increase of homicides during the 90s in São Paulo, this is the graph of homicide rates in the state of São Paulo during the 2000s, as PCC became more and more strong, producing urban order in São Paulo and instrumentalizing mass incarceration to grow and to be strong inside prisons, connected to outside prisons. Chapter 4, I tell a story about how these communications between inside and outside prison works. So we have in 2010, after 10 years of PCC action in the favelas, we have 10 times less homicides in this profile, exactly of this profile. And if we look to the map, homicide rates are decreasing only in the poor neighborhoods. In the central parts of the city where PCC was not so strong, homicide rates became the same. Deaths produced by the police increased. Deaths or killings in robbery increased, but the homicide among criminals decreased a lot. And homicides among criminals were basically the homicides of this profile. I mean, Samuel is a guy that I studied for a long time, since he was a kid. So just to finish, when I understood that everything was in a sense entangled, like the criminal action reacting to the police action, the churches, I won't talk about the churches, but the churches had a very important role in this moment, connecting in a sense the religious moral to criminal action, but to the state reaction as well. So the churches are in between police and crime, or policemen can be part of the church and criminals as well. So there's a lot of different actors and entangled actors producing social order in São Paulo, and especially in poor neighborhoods. And there was a lot of connections and entanglements between legal and illegal markets as well. So I developed this idea, like reading a lot, Luis Antonio Machado da Silva and other authors, from Brazilian authors, Michel Missi and others. And I understood that we have something to tell to urban theory and to like political theory, like from like this very marginal context in São Paulo. So we developed this idea that the urban order is not at all state-centered in the South, and somehow it's not state-centered at all in many places when we are talking about this trend of illegal markets in the world. So that's what we reached in abstract terms, in theoretical terms, discussing with this fieldwork material. So I think I'll stop here, and we can talk a little bit about it. Thanks a lot. That's very strange to not see you, but I hope you're there.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for that fascinating talk. So I think we're going to jump straight into our questions now, as we've got a good selection to get through. So first of all, an attendee has said, thank you for your talk, Gabriel. I wanted to ask how you managed to win interviews with the residents. I'd imagine they were hesitant to talk about their everyday life, which may involve breaking regulations and the law. How did you earn their trust as a researcher?
I started my field work connecting myself to a human rights center in this favela, and I was very helped by the people there. So they were very warm, receiving me in the neighborhood, and they have a lot of connections with different families there. Centro de Defesa dos Direitos da Criança e do Adolescente de Sapopemba. And by this center, especially with people who lived there, but was most related to social action and human rights movements, I started to walk around the favelas and to get in touch with the families. So I really believe in a kind of re-encounter methodology. So if you meet people once, it's one thing. If you meet people 20 times, it's another thing. So I lived in this favela like 1 week a month for years, and I met those people several times, and we talked a lot about our lives, and we exchanged a lot our impressions about the world. I was a very young student when I started my fieldwork, so in a sense I could help some people to study and to get access to the universities. There's a lot of exchange in this, and it bonds relations. So I've never had any adventure or any kind of like trip to the underworld or nothing like that. It was really a research conducted in families' houses, talking to people, and there's a lot of households based on criminal and illegal activities in the margins of São Paulo. So it was not a problem or a secret for no one. There was something that was happening there, and when you get there, you understand that it is something that take part of the average life. So, and then it was another problem to understand what was like constructing this in social terms, but it was like that.
Brilliant, thanks, Gabriel. So another attendee has asked, your argument is very convincing. Violence on different scales are some of the city's fabrics. How do you think favelas might in future coexist with the city's other violences? Is there hope?
Yes, there is hope, I think. I think there's a lot of people, I think there's a lot of transformations, and even if we are I think we are reaching the bottom in terms of political action and etc. But it has to change. It's not possible to continue to repress the small scale operators and not the tax paradise, you know, because those things are really connected. The money from drug trafficking is coming to global brands by consumption. The guys who I studied, they earn money from drug trafficking. They go to the shopping mall and they buy like global brands, Oakley, McDonald's, Subway. So the money flows to legal markets, and there's huge money coming from drug traffic in Brazil, for example, or the car theft that goes to auctioneers that are senators. So I think those things are becoming more explicit, and this kind of scale operation can make those things explicit also to frame different public policies. So in a sense, of course, if we look to the context now and to Brazilian politics and to global politics now, and we are not talking about pandemia, but we are talking about a very, very hard situation. But look into the future, I think we've never understood those connections as we are doing now. And there's a lot of very good works on that, on those, as Caroline Knowles says, back roads of globalization, like how those things are really framing our economies and our social inequalities. So I think we understand more than before, and that's the first step to any change, I think, or I hope.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Gabriel. Another question. Gabriel, the book looks great. The intro is fascinating and has really made me think. Right now, I hate to ask, but what impact has or will COVID-19 make on violence and life in the favelas?
Look, Sapopemba is the second worst neighborhood in São Paulo now, in terms of COVID-19 expansion in deaths. So we are really worried in this moment and talking every day with people there about how could we convince people to stay home and to convince people that we have a real problem, even if they cannot see it. So I'm very, very worried about it, really.
Thank you. And we have another question. Thank you, Gabriel. This is such an important book to have in English. My question is, in your introduction, which I really enjoyed reading, you mentioned you were not surprised by the current political scenario, by Bolsonaro election and the political turn towards a populist and authoritarian style of politics. Would you please elaborate a bit more on this?
Yes, when I started my fieldwork, as I was saying, I was a very young activist, student and activist on human rights. So when we saw like the type of social order we had in the favelas, we understood at that time that it was something that haven't reached democracy already. So we thought democracy would come to the favelas as the democratization processes that was being conducted in Brazil 20 years ago reached the favelas. So we saw a lot of political violence, a lot of criminal violence, a lot of police violence. And we said, no, democracy will allow people to have their voices in public spaces, and we will allow people to have better universities and then better work, and it will transform from the periphery to the center, because I was in a middle class family living in a democracy during the 90s, but the outskirts of the city were living in a war. So we thought the things we've been seeing in peripheries were up to being transformed by democracy. And what happened in Brazil was exactly the opposite. Like the very corrupted political and police forces that were there in the outskirts, and they were fighting against democracy and fighting against human rights and etc. They became the center 20 years after, and we are considered, like in the universities and etc. in Brazil now, we are considered to be the past or the old discourse about the country. So, but I think it's not sustainable. So it was not surprising at all the type of politics we faced, but it was new to have this politics in the center of the country. I mean, it was nothing new for someone who studied the favelas, but it was like very surprising that it came to the center of our politics so fast, at least. So, but thanks a lot for this question. It's very important for me, and I really don't think the kind of politics we have today, like very authoritarian and very populist and very based on repressing the poor and etc. I don't think it's sustainable.
Okay, brilliant. Gabriel. And another question. Gabriel, thanks so much for your talk. As you said, PCC has a very moral discourse in terms of everyday life within the favelas. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the entanglement between PCC and local evangelical churches in the favelas, both in institutional terms. I suppose churches need some kind of authorization from the PCC in order to be established, and in theological terms, how are criminal activities accommodated by religious discourse?
Great question, thanks. In ideological terms, I think they have a kind of structural homology. So evangelicals and PCC think about war, not about democracy, not about a community of citizens, a political community. They think about war and they live in a war. And also, this is a war against the devil or against the system, but it's a war that we fight inside the markets. We don't go to the streets, demonstrate our positions. The evangelicals don't do this, and PCC neither. I mean, they go to the market, and they have to succeed in the market as entrepreneurs, legal or illegal markets, to be part of it. So I think it's Weberian, the kind of homology they have among them in ideological terms. In institutional terms, it's there's a lot of good researchers working on this, and I'm talking about their work as well. Ronaldo Almeida, Patricia Bierman, Cristina Vital, Da Cunha, and others. But in institutional terms, it is from below. The connections are from below. I mean, there's no PCC office to talk with the biggest priest in evangelical church or and decide the connections they will have. It's from below. It's at the level, at street level, in small, very small churches. There's a lot of people combining their needs and their interests and donating money from the crime to the church, and to have some moral protection, being part of the church, to not being like persecuted by the police or by other criminals and etc. So there's other type of connections at institutional level, and it's from below, I would say. Thanks for the question.
Okay, and another question. Were you able to speak to brothers, the official members of the PCC? And if so, how did you gain access, and how did you approach these interviews differently?
Yes, I talked to many people related to PCC and to some brothers, like baptized brothers. But as it is a secret society, as it is a brotherhood, people won't tell you, I am a brother from PCC. And there's a lot of people who know that they are brothers. So my approach was always related to their families. So I never studied one isolated life story, for example. If I started to study a criminal life story, I will interview the whole family and his friends and his relatives and his partners in crime and etc. So normally when I approached brothers from PCC, it was part of a context. It was part of, I knew his mother and his cousin and etc. So it was a kind of network of connections that made me have access to very, very different people, and including PCC members. And they talked to me about the PCC as someone who was doing field work there and writing books about that regions for a long time. So it was not something that was, for example, oh, I want to talk to PCC members now, so I have to reach them who helped me. It was not like that. It was not like that. It was something I was conducting like continual research, and in a moment I reached people. So it was not, okay, talk me about PCC. No, it was something, you can talk me about your life, and then we will get in touch, and next time we will talk about family, and the other time about your work, like a regular work, and then about your work on robberies and etc. So because people, especially in PCC, people are related to many other things than PCC. So many times I reached people from PCC. I realized that they were from PCC during the interview, talking about other stuff. So it was more or less like that. It's really long-term fieldwork.
Okay, brilliant. And a final two questions. In the opening of your book, you say the PCC is now transnational. Could you tell us a little about that? Thanks.
Thanks. Yes, it is. Last week, a huge drug trafficker related to PCC was arrested in Mozambique. I've been to many places where PCC were like acting, because as I said, PCC is not an organization based on territory, as the Red Command, the Comando Vermelho is, for example, and they do not control territories in the same sense with guns and etc. And they are not an enterprise, a company. They are not a military commando. They are really organized as a brotherhood. So, for example, if you have a store, say an informal store selling stolen auto parts, or if you have a junkyard to dismantle a car, or if you have a stolen car, or if you have a place to sell cocaine, it's your business. It's not PCC business, it's your business. But you can be also a brother from PCC and have a network of connections to improve your business. So there's a lot of PCC members doing their business outside Brazil, doing their business in Middle East, in Europe, in Africa, in Central America, and especially in South America, very especially in Paraguay, Bolivia, Colombia. So there's a lot of connections between PCC and other criminal groups and other criminal entrepreneurs, but not necessarily a connection between the PCC as a whole, and for example the FARC as a whole, or the Italian mafia as a whole. But there's a lot of connections again from below that we can understand from below, I think.
Okay, brilliant. And one final question. The community projects are the leading roles in the favelas in the combat of COVID-19. Do you think that this is the confirmation that state policies don't understand enough of the life there to help the population in their demands?
Sorry, I didn't get, there was a kind of problem here. Sorry, Alice.
Okay, I'm going to read it one more time. The community projects are the leading roles in the favelas in the combat of COVID-19. Do you think that this is confirmation that the state policies don't understand enough of the life there to help the population in their demands?
It's a difficult question because I'm not doing field work now, but I read something about Paraisópolis, that is the biggest favela in São Paulo, probably. And there are a very strong community organization and leaders, street by street, trying to manage the situation and to have a kind of quick response for people who are there exposed to virus and etc. In Sapopemba, the grassroots organizations are also acting a lot, and I'm sure it's a kind of complementation, or they are acting together, the state, in many senses. Like these normative regimes, for me, they are not always clashing among others. There's a lot of really coexisting and partnerships and sometimes wars, but it depends on the situation. That's why situation became something very important for us. The Ministry of Health, the former Ministry of Health, that was doing a kind of honest job and was fired by Bolsonaro last week. The Ministry of Health, told in the television that he had to talk to criminals in favelas because it was very important for the health and etc. So in these moments, in these situations, those regimes can act together, sure. So let's see what happens the following weeks, but we are really worried. In a sense, there's a lot of people who trust much more in crime, for example, to say, okay, we have a curfew, no one would leave home and etc., than in the state. So sometimes it works, and it will be a very interesting moment in this sense to analyze those regimes acting together and against themselves in different situations. Thanks for the question as well. Very interesting questions. Thank you very much.
Okay.